Every day it feels like another tally is put up on the board of the egregious crimes that are inflicted on our country, and we get a brand new reminder of how we're second-class citizens and how the moral ledger of our nation is imbalanced. And one of the worst in recent months is, of course, the brutal murder of Henry Nowak by the Sikh family of Vikram Digwa, and we now have new police body cam footage that shows Digwa lying to the police, again, pretending to be the victim, and pulling a surprise Pikachu face when he gets arrested after Henry has already died in custody from wounds that he would not admit to inflicting. And this video is just infuriating, because Digwa first complains that the police lights are too bright in his eyes. Well, you should have thought about that before stabbing an innocent man to death. And then the police don't even handcuff him after confirming that Henry is dead and arresting him for attempted murder. At all stages of the police process, the police sided against Henry. They were going to release a statement after Henry's death, depicting him as the aggressor, as the perpetrator of a racist attack even after he had been killed. They encouraged Digwa's family to be forthcoming about the fictional racist abuse that Henry had perpetrated against his murderers. And then they treated Digwa with more dignity than Henry Nowak, whose dying body they dragged across the gravel even after he was protesting that he was in pain and needed urgent medical attention. This led to the famous response to Henry saying, "I've been stabbed." "I don't think you have, mate." And people can only tolerate so many of these grave injustices. The butchering of 3 girls at a dance class in Southport by Rwandan anti-white terror-obsessive Axel Rudakabana, whose family has still not been charged, by the way, despite knowingly purchasing his weapons that he just kept buying off of Amazon, knowing he was making rice in, knowing that he tried to stab his former school about a week before perpetrating the Southport massacre. Nope, they're still in taxpayer-funded witness protection. Digwa's brother and father haven't been charged as accomplices to murder yet either. And Digwa and Rudakabana, yeah, they've got whole life sentences, but if they behave themselves behind bars, they will be eligible for a parole hearing. Speaking of which, the ringleader of the Rochdale grooming gang, this is Shabir Ahmed, who forced his child victims to call him daddy, denied all charges, and interrupted his own sentencing by ripping off his shirt, tearing out chunks of his chest hair, and accusing the police, the court, the government of a racist conspiracy against Pakistanis, who he said were the master race, not you white bastards. Yeah, he's coming to the end of his prison sentence. He was convicted in 2012 for multiple counts of sexual offences against children, and now documents from the probation service to one of his victims state he will be released this coming Thursday, and he cannot be deported because of a loophole in the 1971 Immigration Act, and because Sajid Javid, a Pakistani man born in Rochdale, who was our Home Secretary, whose brother Baz Javid is currently in charge of immigration at the Home Office, refused to negotiate his return to Pakistan back in 2018. And so now this guy is going to be out on the street. So even if they get a prison sentence, it's far too late for the crimes they've committed. There is no hope of rehabilitation. They are remorseless, unrepentant for their crimes. Axel Rudakabana relished in the fact that his youngest victim was just 6 years old. He interrupted his court proceedings by shrieking hysterically, causing a scene. None of these people should have been in our country in the first place, but none of them should ever have the prospect of seeing sunlight again. And the majority of the public feel this way. The majority of the public are sickened by the idea that these people can take and ruin thousands of lives, and yet not suffer a punishment as proportionate to the misery they've inflicted on innocent children. And so this is why there has been a growing chorus for the return of the death penalty in Britain. Now, Britain had the death penalty for well over 1,000 years, until it was abolished in 1965 via a private member's bill by Sidney Silverman. It was tabled for reintroduction in the Criminal Justice and Public Order Bill 1994 under John Major's government, but it was defeated, and that was the last effort to ever bring it back. There have not been any whipless votes for its reintroduction for quite some time, because, despite widespread public support for the death penalty, Parliament haven't supported it for the last 30 or so years. And the reintroduction is actually blocked under Protocol 6 and Protocol 13 of the European Convention on Human Rights, enshrined into British law by Tony Blair's Human Rights Act. So even if you wanted to bring it back, you couldn't do that without repealing the Human Rights Act and leaving the ECHR. This is something that both Reform UK and Restore Britain have committed to. This is something that the Conservatives have floated, though they're largely interested in disapplying parts of the Human Rights Act and ECHR instead. So, yet again, another half measure by Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives. Nevertheless, the more crimes that are committed of this nature, the more the public want it. The polling's been consistent. Here's the most recent. So, almost half of British students support the return of the death penalty. You know, those notably, disproportionately, socially progressive students, young people in our country. Yeah, almost half of them support the reintroduction of the death penalty. 47% of undergraduates aged 18 to 21, 46% opposed it for any crimes. This result places the 1,018 students surveyed almost exactly in line with the wider public, among whom 50% support capital punishment and 45% oppose it. And this shouldn't be that surprising, because in January 2025, when the Southport trial was ongoing, the Times published that 3 in 5 millennials, that's 58%, said that capital punishment should be introduced. Just over a quarter, 27%, opposed. The survey was carried out by More in Common, and they found considerable increase in support for the death penalty since its last poll in autumn 2023. The overall portion of the public who think it should be brought back for certain crimes increased from 50 to 55%, while opposition dropped from 37 to 32%. The shift has been most pronounced among Gen X, aged 44 to 59, 60 now, whose net support for the death penalty increased by 16 points, and the polling was conducted after the sentencing of Axel Ruda-Cabana. Ruda-Cabana actually avoided a whole life order because he was under 18 at the time of the murders, so he's sentenced to a minimum of 52 years in prison, which is the longest sentence given to a teenage murderer, but it means he'll be let out, likely, before he dies. 59% of Britons thought the sentence was too soft, only a third said it was about right, only 2% thought it was too tough. So people think that he should at the very least remain the rest of his life in prison, but a majority of the public think he should be eligible for the death penalty. I mean, look at his face. He's basically the poster boy for it. There is nothing going on behind those eyes beyond pure malice. He is never going to be a benefit to our civilization. He will never be able to make up for the grief that he has inflicted, not just on the victims' families, but the entire country. The only way to redress this imbalance, even by a fraction, is to ensure that the families who he has bereaved of their daughters don't have to work to pay for his bed and board for the rest of his life, or for the 52 years that he will remain in prison. Less if he behaves himself. If you add qualifiers to the polling, support actually goes up. A majority backed the death penalty against rapists, 56% in favour, and 44% opposed. Now, there are arguments that actually you get more convictions if you don't apply the death penalty for rape, but I think in the likes of Shabir Ahmed, and in cases of other Pakistani grooming gang perpetrators, where there are multiple women who come forward that say, hey, this guy did this to me, and they're all credible, or the taxi cab rapist, for example, who abused hundreds of women, by the sounds of it, yeah, I think that's a valid circumstance for which to put these predators to death. 7 in 10 support capital punishment for serial murderer or terrorism that results in death. So if you say, for example, Lee Rigby's killers, they're on camera doing it, they're gleeful about doing it, they hung around the scene next to Lee Rigby's dismembered body with the bloody cleaver, they yelled Allahu Akbar when they were sentenced. They now just get to spend their life in prison, going to mosque every day, doing exactly what they wanted. They think they're martyrs for the cause. Okay, I believe they will never repent for their crimes, and I don't believe it's even possible for them to do so. God might, but, you know, maybe we should expedite the date at which they go to meet him. And it's important to note here that the Times finds support is strongest among Reform UK voters. 79% support and just 14% opposed. Of Conservative voters, it's 62% support, 28% opposed. Labour, 49% support, 43% opposed. The Liberal Democrats have the highest level of opposition, 54% opposed and only 37% support. And that's because the Liberal Democrats are incredibly rich liberals who want to signal their progressive credentials to their dinner parties because they never actually believe that they're going to be the victims of the policies they support. Diversity and all of its costs and crimes will never come to their leafy green area of the southwest, now would it? But despite a majority of Labour and Conservative voters supporting the death penalty, Labour and Conservative MPs, historically, haven't. There was some social attitude survey data conducted by UK in a Changing Europe in June of 2020, and it found that 50% of the public support the death penalty, and 31% of Labour voters do, so it's increased in that time, but just 11% of Labour members and none of the Labour Parliamentary Party compared to 21% of Tory MPs. So your average Labour voter is to the right of your average Tory MP and to all Labour MPs on the issues of criminal justice and the death penalty. So Labour and Conservative voters lack substantive representation on this issue, and it is a moral issue. And it's not just a matter of freeing up prison space, as Keir Starmer was so eager to do to throw his ideological enemies and people putting social media posts out in the aftermath of the Southport massacre in there instead. It's not just about whether or not we think that the criminal themselves will ever reoffend or are incapable of contrition. It's that there's a kind of psychological burden that our country bears if you can take a life and not suffer a punishment that is proximate to that grave crime. Essentially, we just allow the worst among us to do untold harm to law-abiding, tax-paying, peaceful members of our civilization, to our friends and family. And they don't suffer because of it. And most people feel that that's just wrong. And so they would like some representation on this issue. As far as political representation goes, Restore Britain have committed to holding a binding referendum on restoring the death penalty. I believe this will be a public referendum, and the outcome of that will be pretty obvious. I think that's a good policy. As far as Reform UK goes, Nigel Farage responded to a question in June of last year from a reporter at The Sun on what the party's position on the death penalty was, and Farage said, quote, "These are issues of conscience, just as the assisted dying debate will be when it comes up, just as the abortion limit is. These are all issues of conscience. Nothing on the death penalty will be part of party policy." I have to say, personally, given there have been 500 quite serious miscarriages of justice in this country since the early 1970s, I don't think I could ever support it, but I understand why others take a different point of view, and those include people in his party. It wasn't just Rupert Lowe, who was a Reform MP at the time of this Times polling. Richard Tice actually reiterated the calls from Lee Anderson, who has been one of the more vocal MPs on this issue, who posted a picture of a noose on his X account in response to Axel Rudicabaner's sentencing, saying, "No apologies here, this is what is required." Based. Fact is, most Reform members and a good number of Reform MPs support the death penalty. I would wager that Danny Kruger wouldn't. Not so sure about James Orr, of course, who was head of Reform's policy. If I were a betting man, I think Zia Yusuf would say, "Hand me the sword and I'll do it myself." Nevertheless, in the business of asking political parties to do what we want, getting them to take our side rather than just us taking theirs, I think it's a sensible policy for Reform to adopt, to at least say we will either have a whip-free vote in Parliament, if we have a parliamentary majority on the death penalty, or a public national referendum. I mean, the last time we had a large-scale referendum was Brexit, and Farage has a track record on winning referendums. And I wouldn't be surprised if you asked Farage now if his opinion has changed after seeing the Henry Nowak case, after seeing in the headlines every single day just a new horror that just didn't need to happen. And reinstating the death penalty will send a message to the international criminal networks that treat our country like a brothel or a red room, that said, if you get caught committing a crime in our country, you will face either a whole life sentence, or you will be deported, or, depending on the crime, we might deem deportation to be too kind, and, well, rope is cheap, and it's a British tradition. And given David Bull, who, when I said that line on breakfast television about 2 years ago, crashed out at me, given David Bull is no longer Reform's chairman, I think the appetite within the internal party of Reform to reflect the concerns of its base may well be growing. So I'm just putting this video out there as a free policy idea for anyone who wants to take it up. Binding referendum on the death penalty for the next government to solve Britain's criminal problem, to rebalance our national moral ledger. It's a good idea. Death penalty, bring it forth.